Today in RimWorld, as a trio of the UNSC's finest Marines stranded on an alien planet, we are going to be surviving endless, countless waves of hordes of enemies through Winston waves, baby. Now, for our first wave, we are going to be fighting the Flood. If you watched a few of my other attempts through these videos, I have always been fighting the Flood. Now, our first wave is going to be the same. However, this planet is mostly populated with the UNSC, who is going to be our allies, of course, as well as the Covenant. So the rest of our wave should be Covenant forces and maybe a mix of the Flood here and there. We're also going to be starting with the standard crash-landed scenario and all the resources that come along with that. With one slight modification, the weapons and armor that come along with that scenario are going to be swapped out with some more appropriate UNSC counterparts, of course. Oh, whoopsie, I almost missed one there. Goodbye, pair of pants. This may seem a little bit OP at first, as the weapons and armor of the UNSC are of course better than what you would normally start with the crash-landed scenario, but given the type of enemies that we're going to be facing, I feel that this is pretty fair. Besides, if things get a little bit too rough, I'm sure our good boy here will rip out the alien hearts of our invaders. Aw, won't you, boy? That's a good boy. But first things first, we are immediately going to be building some armored embrasures out of steel, as well as armored walls, giving us some cover effectiveness as well as allowing us to shoot out at our enemies. This was interrupted though when we were being attacked by Flood infection forms, one of which would end up infecting our poor doggo, killing her damn near instantly, but not turning her, surprisingly. The infection forms would continue pouring through our little narrow strait here and trying to attack us. Eventually we would finish them off though. Oddly enough though, this was not our first wave of enemies, but it was actually a pre-created hive, I suppose, that was already in the area. Regardless of if they were here already or if it was part of our first wave, they did end up killing our poor puppers. And for that, this damn dirty hive would pay the ultimate price. We went out in a little squad and began firing at it as well as its turrets, attempting to destroy it and eradicate it from this region, of course, not only for our puppers and revenge, but also to try to keep the area safe. Another way that we were keeping ourselves somewhat safe, if only passively, I suppose you could say, is by building a nice warm campfire right next to where we would be sleeping under the stars for the night. Not only keeping us warm, but also the Flood hates fire, and thus it would probably try to stay away. Throughout the night, we could hear the echoing through the mountains and valleys of this area, something like a laser weapon being fired. Upon closer inspection, it would seem that a Forerunner Sentinel was here and was actually killing off all of the Flood. This would have been incredibly useful in the last few videos where we've only been fighting the Flood, but I guess it would have made things too easy as well. There is a production area or something like that, I suppose, where these are actually being produced, more and more Sentinels as the Flood kills them and as they kill the Flood. So that should help us out quite a bit. That doesn't mean though that the Flood still won't be an issue, but it does mean that they should go around the region killing what's left over after each raid where we fight the Flood, so that's pretty great. Nevertheless though, we would still need to continue our defenses, as we're not only going to be fighting the Flood, we're most likely going to be fighting the Covenant as the majority of the enemy forces, of course. So not only would we finish up some walls and embrasures on our eastern side, but we would also go over to the western side and do a bit of the same. Although we didn't put as many embrasures in, as I don't really expect to be fighting as many enemies through that way. I want to try to funnel them in through the east. By this point, we've also gathered up a lot of resources, including many of those that we also had already landed with, so we started working on a small storage building to keep those out of the elements. We had also, and I don't really know how to explain this because it looks bad, okay? We had also left our dog out and it started rotting. Now, I did this to make sure it wasn't going to turn into a Flood infection, because, well, it was indeed infected by the Flood, so it was a bit of a test, as sad as it is, but now it's time for us to bury here. For what little bit of reserves of time that we had left before our first wave, we started working on some proper housing for the Marines, that way they're not constantly having mental breaks, and we also started working on some proper power production so we can get some lights going, as well as some turrets in the very near future. But as was inevitable, our very first wave would come. Now, this wasn't all that interesting, because as the infection forms even got close to our walls, the Sentinels began destroying them. And before the remainder of their group could start making their way here, the exact same thing happened, which was super cool and badass. For our very first reward, we would end up choosing a random normal reward, which I'm normally not too fond of, and this time around we ended up getting some gene packs, which was pretty cool. Some of them seemed useful, I suppose. And as previously discussed, you can see that Wave 2 is going to be the Covenant forces. Now, for a Wave 2, we have a lot of these enemies coming through, so I'm just a little bit nervous. Before the wave would end up making its way here, we continued working on our housing as well as our power. Once we finally got that finished up, it was pretty great because, well, we could finally see inside our structures now. And then, holy shit, our second wave had finally arrived. And there were quite a few soldiers. Now, you might think that this shouldn't be too much of a concern, but the problem is, they had grunts with heavy artillery, as well as a few with normal weapons like plasma pistols. They had jackal snipers, which, if you're unfamiliar, are basically dead-eyed shooters. They had skirmishers with needle rifles, which, if we get shot too many times with one of those, we will explode, quite literally, and they are very fast and very nimble. And they also had Sanghelis who were leading them with plasma rifles, which could easily burn through our armor and were incredibly hard to take down. I'm beginning to think that we may have had a much better chance of survival if we were only fighting the Flood. Oh, and let's not forget about the fact that the Sentinels won't attack these humanoids, they only attack the Flood. Their skirmishers, grunts, and jackals were some of the first to begin approaching, and thankfully they were already hitting our wooden spike traps, but there were far too many of them, more than we had expected, of course, so the spike traps didn't really do much to the later members. And because of that, they were pouring right through our defenses, and we were forced to try to kill as many of them as possible with much more inferior weapons. Thankfully though, we managed to kill enough of their jackals, skirmishers, and grunts that we had technically defeated the wave by forcing the others to retreat. As our reward, we decided to go with a xeno-human joining us. We attempted to try to flee away from their fleeing forces before that plasma cut us in half. And once they had left the region, we got a look at our xeno-human, who happened to be a Neanderthal by the name of Harry, which kinda sucks. I was hoping to get some type of Sangheli, grunt, or jackal or something of our own that would be equipped with some proper weapons, but whatever. We damn near lost Ace during the fight, and Scotty himself was extremely injured. And I'm beginning to realize that the Flood might have been easier than I had initially gave them credit for, but compared to the Covenant, at least, because this was very difficult and was only Wave 2. Now, they had dropped plenty of different resources and items like silver and food, which would be great if we can manage to survive long enough to try to utilize it. Something that they had dropped that would be very useful, though, right from the get-go, was going to be all these plasma-based weapons. Harry also decided to throw a party for celebration of our victory, or at least our survival, I guess we could say. But I was quite glad that this happened as well, as it really kept spirits high and kept everyone from having mental breaks. By this point, we had also equipped all of the plasma weapons that we needed. Now, multiple Marines and Pawns are going to be carrying multiple different types of weapons, but since everyone here has a pretty good shooting stat, most of them are going to mainly be equipping the beam rifles. Wave 3 would finally arrive, and it ended up being the Flood once more. As you could imagine, not much to talk about here, as it was quite easy with the Sentinels taking them out for us. Since we already had plenty of medicine, and the normal weapons were most likely not going to be any better than what we already had with our plasma weapons from the Covenant forces we fought, we decided to go with prosthetics. These would end up dropping, and there were quite a few bionics that would be useful once we get someone with a good medical staff. We also began utilizing our resources to build ourselves a large battery in a little makeshift room so that it doesn't explode when it gets rained on, and this way we can actually go about powering a turret all throughout the night and day. For now, we're only going to be building involving one military-style turret, and honestly, that's just because I don't expect it to really do all that much to our Covenant enemies. It would mostly be a deterrent or distraction, and it would be pretty good against the Flood, but we don't really have to worry about them so far. Since our next wave is going to be Covenant forces, we're also going to be putting a heavy focus into building more wooden spike traps, as that seems to be what saved our asses the first time. Once the fourth wave had finally arrived, we noticed that it was mostly Sangheili and grunts, which, if we can kill enough of the grunts, we could probably make them flee, but we are going to have to kill some of the Sangheili as well to go about doing so, which is going to be very hard. While they were preparing before they attacked, we started working on some additional defenses that would allow us to try to hide from their line of sight. Initially, we thought our embrasures in the walls were going to be only for us, but it seems to be better for them, as we just can't really kill them all that quickly. Eventually, they would finally begin to approach our base for their attack. We also had hope that them walking through a little field of the corpses, rotting corpses of their fallen allies, might deter them a little bit, but to no avail. As they approached, we attempted to take cover, trying to keep some distance between us and the Sangheili so that we could shoot them with our beam rifles, hopefully getting a headshot and killing them, but they were quickly closing the gap between us. We put up a hell of a fight, we really did, and with these plasma cannons, we managed to kill a few grunts and a Sangheili, just one singular Sangheili, before they eventually took every single one of our members down. And with that, we had easily been defeated. They even started attempting to kidnap us while they were leaving the area. I think my biggest issue here is that I was treating the Covenant fight like I would with the Flood, and they are a far more superior enemy in terms of their armor and weapons. So we would need far more superior soldiers. Reinforcements would arrive in a trio of Spartans, well equipped to take on any Covenant forces. It would seem that maybe we have finally given them their match. No longer were we cowering and hiding, but we were chasing down the Sangheili who were attempting to kidnap our Marines. With the wave defeated, we would end up choosing our reward, this time around once again being that a colonist would join us, just a normal human of course. Again, I like to reiterate that most of these videos right now with Winston waves are simply a little bit of practice in me learning about the different types of waves and the factions that we're fighting and stuff using the mod list that I'm currently using, and so we are just now really figuring out that the Covenant are this damn strong against normal UNSC Marines, and thus why I felt that it might be fair to send in this Spartan team. I wanted to mention though, as the Spartans are saving our Marines, unfortunately Harry would end up bleeding to death as he was being kidnapped, so he's dead. We do however have our new colonist going by the name of Joshua, so I suppose he can be a replacement for Harry. Even with our new trio of Spartans though, we had a lot of work to do, such as putting out the fires, which wasn't too hard since it started raining in our storage facility, as well as rebuilding all of our shelves. During which time, our poor Marine Ace would end up getting two infections, one in his left foot and the other in his torso. Now, normally we'd just cut off the limb if we couldn't heal it in time, but thanks to us having a good bit of medicine and decent medicine at that, he should be okay. Our fifth wave would finally arrive, and once again it was the Flood. Before the Sentinels could even get close enough to go about trying to kill them, they found their way to our corpse pile and began reanimating these corpses as Flood combat forms. Leaving a corpse pile outside of our base walls is probably not the best idea. Thankfully, even so, the Sentinels would come to our aid and start attacking the combat forms, but there were far too many, and the first Sentinel would be easily overpowered. Although, this did mean that the wave was over, so time to collect our reward. I'll say the Colonist was probably the better choice here, but I've never chose Shamblers before, so I wanted to give it a shot. With this decent-sized little group of soulless vessels, hopefully we'll be able to protect ourselves against Covenant forces using them like a, group of zombies. That's basically what they are. Before the next wave though, we were sure to go out as a large group and finish off the remaining combat forms platforms. That way our region is safe and we can still wander out and mine and cut down trees and stuff like that without worry. We would need these resources for things like our defenses once more with spike traps, and we also would end up using them for some more residential housing for some of our newest members like the Spartans, as well as some more wooden embrasures and walls and yada yada yada. Wave 6 had finally come around, mostly comprised of grunts and jackal snipers, and believe a few skirmishers were in there as well, but there were some saying Healy, so that gave a good bit of cause for concern. We were easily managing to mow down the jackals and the grunts, as they were of course the weakest members, but as the large group of enemies continued coming our way, we started to pull back a little bit. Realistically, our Spartans were some of our only members who would be tough enough to take quite a few shots from these plasma weapons. Even so, one of them would fall and we would have to come together as a group to defeat the remaining Covenant forces. Even our shamblers got a little excited, but looks like they missed the party. Our reward for this wave, it was really only going to be the random normal reward, which this time around I was tickled about because it was plasteel dropping into the area. This is probably one of the only useful random rewards that I've gotten for quite some time. Also, thankfully nobody died from that wave, even though we kinda got our shit kicked out of us. In other good news, Ace had finally developed immunity to the infection that was trying to murder him. We also would end up building a radio terminal along with an orbital trade beacon. That way, if we have any traders in orbit around the planet, we'll be able to buy things from them and sell things to them. I'm sure you've probably noticed by this point, but it seems that the Covenant forces always carry a good bit of silver along with them. So we're basically rich, but we don't have anyone to buy and sell with unless we travel out of the area. Not that we really need to buy any weapons or anything like that, as we have an absolute shit ton of them, especially some powerful ones like the fuel rod cannon. But things like advanced components and resources would of course be very useful. Now then, before our next wave, we attempted to begin digging out a small section of the mountain near our entrance into the base. That way we could try to use it by putting embrasures in there for defensive purposes. But the next wave would come before we could even do that. It was just the flood again though, and nothing really interesting here happened. The sentinels finished them off before they even got near the base, and it's time for our reward again. And though mini turrets aren't a bad option realistically against the armor of the Covenant forces, they're gonna be pretty they're not really gonna work, right? So we decided to go with food, especially since we haven't been growing any and all of our previous food basically burnt. And with that, it feels like a good time that we build a proper kitchen along with food storage area. It's funny, normally this is one of the first things that I would build in a colony, but I guess just because of the looming threat of another wave every 5 minutes, I end up building these a little bit later on. It's just fun to see how things change with Winston waves. With that completed, it was time for us to start working on our new defensive perimeter here inside the hill. As mentioned, I am mining out a few sections and we're replacing those with embrasures. I'm also putting up a steel barricade, that way we can hide behind it if things start getting a little bit too hairy. Wave 8 would finally drop into the area, and this raid appeared to be mostly comprised of grunts and jackals. Actually, upon second glance, I think it is solely comprised of grunts and jackals. This is going to be a field day. By the time night fell, they were beginning to approach our base, and we were jumping out from behind our wooden walls and beginning to fire at them. It was also around this time that our shamblers would finally get their first taste of real battle. Though I was interested in seeing how they would perform against any enemy waves, they were essentially cannon fodder against the superior plasma weaponry. It appears that it would be solely up to our Marines and Spartans. But as we began pulling back, as the enemies began pouring in, we would end up losing one of our Spartans. But there was hardly any time to focus on our loss, as we had to rush behind our walls to finish this fight. Once the battle had finally ended and the Covenant forces were retreating from the area as we were firing at them and trying to kill as many as humanly possible, we would finally have a brief moment to grieve for our fallen brother. Perhaps I had underestimated just how strong a force of jackals and grunts really was. I believe that he was killed due to a blamite explosion, reiterating my point from earlier in the video with just how powerful the needlers are. In a not so strange turn of events, for our reward this time around, I ended up choosing some stone blocks, as we once again didn't need weapons, and there was also a good chance that the meteorite wasn't going to be anything useful that we needed like plasteel or silk. Besides, we could supplement stone blocks for silver, and that way we don't waste as much for embrasures and walls. Once things had calmed down quite a bit, we would end up burying our fellow Spartan, though it is important to remember that Spartans never truly die. They're only missing in action. Now then, thanks to all of our new stone as well, and most importantly, most likely, our plasteel, we could actually go about deconstructing many of our old embrasures and wooden walls, which, let's be honest, really sucked in terms of defenses, and we could end up using those resources as well as our plasteel to go about creating our very first autocannon with some slate embrasures. I built it farther away, that way there's a less likely chance of it getting destroyed by plasma weapons, and it can just barely reach our enemies. However, before the next raid, we ended up having Joshua apparently be fed up with civilization because he observed some rotting corpses, oh boo-hoo, and he decided to run wild in the region. But whatever, I don't care. One, Joshua was my least favorite anyhow, and two, who needs him? We did, however, have an exotic goods trader in orbit around the planet, and we would end up purchasing many a thing from them, such as components, advanced components, a juggernaut serum, and even a tube television, as I thought that people might like to watch it for their recreational purposes. Since the only place that we really have any seating is inside our kitchen, that's exactly where we put the television, and it sure as hell beats the shit out of the horseshoe pin that we've been using up until this point. Wave 9 finally came, and it was actually two decent-sized groups of flood coming from the northern and southern sections of the region. The raid coming in from the north was quickly and easily taken care of by the sentinels, while the one coming from the south would be one we'd have to deal with on our own, but it was pretty easy too. Something interesting did end up happening though, when Joshua, who you probably remember 2 minutes ago, ended up going wild and wanted to live out in the forest, right, like a caveman, ended up getting bit by the flood and was mad at us for some reason. A massive mistake on his part, because we've been looking for a reason to kill him, but you know what? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Isn't that right, Joshua? See that there? He can't tell you, because we shot him. He's dead. The obvious reward choice here was going to be 60 components and 15 advanced components, which was just absolutely amazing, especially on top of the ones that we had already purchased. We'll definitely be using them for defenses, as it looks like Wave 10 is going to have quite a few members that are attacking us. Many of them are going to be Geralhani, the brutes, which we've actually yet to see in any previous waves. And also just so happens to be a double trouble raid as well. This should be interesting. Well, using our new components and what have you, we are going to be building ourselves a biofuel refinery, a machining table, as well as an additional solar panel for power generation. We would waste absolutely no time refining plenty of wood into chem fuel, that way we could immediately start producing some explosive artillery shells, and we would end up building a large artillery cannon instead of a mortar, the reason realistically being because it doesn't require a reinforced barrel, and I was too lazy to go about creating one. Some of you fine folks have been giving me suggestions about trying to use mortars and artillery and what have you during these challenges, and realistically I should have started with a mortar, or at least tried to build it earlier on, and I think it would be perfect against the Flood, but we'll try it against the Covenant just for shits and giggles. However, there is also something else that we need. We are calling in the heavy artillery from the brass in the UNSC. That's right, they are airdropping us a Scorpion tank. This bad son of a bitch is going to be a lot of fun, but I am afraid that having our tank with us here is obviously going to make the raid a little bit unfair for our enemies, so I've decided to up the ante a bit. Now that is a raid of enemies worth fighting with a Scorpion, I'd say. Our enemies were absolutely flooding the battlefield and would absolutely begin flooding through into our courtyard here of the base. As we began launching plenty of fuel rods in their general direction, the tank was going to be in hot pursuit. The treads of the Scorpion were about to be sticky and warm with gallons upon gallons of alien blood. So much, in fact, that the treads got stuck, and we were stuck here trying to fire at them with our cannon instead. The cowardice Jerohani were beginning to flee the area, but not before we would get what we wanted. Their lives, and more importantly, their souls. For the UNSC's demons have really come to play. And with that, we had finally defeated Wave 10. Though it be much larger than anticipated, we did technically have a lot of help in the form of our new tank. Either way though, that was a lot of fun. I'll see you later.